So last time we talked about how important religion is and what it means to have an identity that is religiously informed. And so every single aspect of your life is governed and has been governed over the last sort of 150 years, ever since Henry VIII decided to start mucking around with the Catholic Church and start his own. People's religious identities have been the question of the day. I mean, that's the constant refrain, and it has consequences. It had consequences through the two, well, the revolutions that we had, the civil wars that we had, and now by the time we hit 1714, we're back now at the beginning where religion is still important. And as I said last week, it is very important, but it's not going to be the defining factor so much so. That's not to say it's not important or that it's not something to keep an eye on, but it is something that is going to wane with importance as other things will take its place. So really, by the time we get to the 17th century, we have two different kinds of history being argued about. The conflicts that we have in the 1600s are the things that everybody's going to be talking about in the 1700s, and this is going to be how history is written and how history is discussed. And depending on what school you come from, or what party you come from, so to speak, you will discuss and understand and interpret this history very differently. So there are really two revolutions which have major impact. And if you want sort of heavier detail, then you can look at the lectures from last class. Sorry, not last class, the other module that we did last year. But in short, we have a couple of revolutions which have impact. And Georgian Britain, which is the period that we're in, Georgian Britain now has to figure this out, has to work its way through this to understand what does this mean for us now? Because as I said, these are rival histories of British history. And they are applied by people in the 18th century, in the 1700s, to people in their particular contexts. And this is actually something that we always think about historiography. Most people, when they write history, or at least most people, what they think when they're writing history, is that we are writing some very objective and impassionate, or dispassionate rather, account of what happened in the past. And some of that may be true, but a lot of the time we're actually applying or using things in the past to talk about our current present issues. And we may not necessarily be very aware of this, sometimes we are, but this is often the case, and this is the case back in this time period that we're talking about. And it's important to remember this, that historiography, this is a form of historiography, how we write history. That's what historiography is. So we have two revolutions, anyway, that we want to talk about. The first is the major set of revolutions, or civil war, I guess, from 1642 to 1660. This is known as the Great Rebellion, according to the Earl of Clarendon. And its cause was really a Reformation process, but a very long-term one, which lasted all the way until the 1820s, if you read Jonathan Clark, for example, where religion is very important. It is ultimately a religious war between the Puritans on one side and the establishment on the other. And it's full of all sorts of constitutional tensions between Parliament and King. These are structural, there are massive structural problems in the idea of the state. And of course, in many ways, this is, you could argue, the beginning of the modern state in Britain at the time. At least the things that Oliver Cromwell starts to bring in with his army and various other institutions that begin to pop up. This is probably a time when things are on the move. It is very much so a British revolution. It is largely England versus Scotland and Ireland. And it ends with a regicide. It ends with the execution of the king. And there are legacies of this regicide, which are also important. there are Republican legacies of this. Obviously, Republicans, not in the American sense, but in the British sense, are people who don't like monarchs, who don't want a monarch. They want a republic. And according to Republicans, at least, they were justified in the resistance of the tyranny of what was going on. There are socially radical people who wish to abolish things like the House of Lords, and that was definitely one of the things that was attempted. We have the introduction of various other socially radical movements, such as the Levelers and the Diggers, who wanted to change the way in which society was structured and the way that we thought about things within that society. They wanted greater say to those who had smaller property. They wanted political representation. The Leveler movement would absolutely influence Thomas Paine, who we will talk about a little bit later. And many of their ideas would be stolen sort of wholesale by the Declaration of Independence. So they were onto something, at least. Another legacy of the regicide was the collapse of the censorship of the press. Very often, of course, the press would be controlled because that's what you want. In any situation, you don't want people running willy-nilly backwards and forwards saying whatever they want. Otherwise, you end up with Donald Trump. But in this particular case, there is a burgeoning freedom of the press, which is great as far as, if you're into that kind of thing. And perhaps another legacy is high taxation. Previously, kings tended to call parliaments to apply taxes. So you're a king, you're out of money, and you say, okay, let's have a tax on wine. And so you tax wine for a year or however long you want. And parliament says, okay, here you go. So they tax all the wine in Britain, and then the king takes that money and he gets to use it for whatever he needs it to do. And then the tax would stop. And the first revolution, I suppose, the Civil War, saw an introduction of a taxation system that was near constant. Now, it wasn't across everything, but it was the beginning of a near constant taxing system. So whereas once upon a time, you might have sort of been relieved from time to time of having to pay tax, now more people had to pay more tax more of the time. It wasn't very well received, that idea, but eventually, I suppose, resistance to it disappeared. So that's where we are now. The legacy of the first Civil War, I suppose, or the two civil wars, was that Anglicanism, which is the state version of Christianity, is replaced by Presbyterianism. And this is going to destroy religious uniformity. One of the things that's kind of difficult, I guess, especially as Protestants, and Protestants after the Enlightenment, I guess, even more so, is this idea that we have come from a time period where everybody believes the same thing to a time where everybody believes different things. And that has certain sort of social and I suppose mental consequences. And this is going to have consequences in the 18th century too. So we end up with a divided society, and the long-term implications are that nothing is healed very, very quickly. People tend to see themselves as heir to one of the two sides, either the what will essentially end up being the Whigs or the Tories. Either you're a pro-monarch, so to speak, or you're pro-parliament, and this will have certain consequences. So that's our first revolution that everybody has to deal with. The second revolution is the Glorious Revolution in 1688. And this is the one that's most commonly invoked in the 18th century. It's triggered by fears triggered by arbitrary fears of a monarch over parliament. And it was brought about with the fear of popery. So people are worried that the monarch will take things into his own hands that he's not supposed to. I think this is actually kind of interesting, just given at the moment with the kerfuffle that's happening in the States at the moment with the fears of what will happen if Donald Trump gets voted in again. What will he do with his powers? He said very clearly at certain points that he's going to do this. And people on the right are like, yes, this is fantastic. What we want nothing more than Donald Trump doing these kinds of things, acting like an autocrat. And the people on the sort of the left are up in arms about this. How dare he do such a thing? What do you think our forefathers were doing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the Glorious Revolution is a little bit like this. There is a European context to this. We are invaded for the second time, actually, in British history. The first time was Julius Caesar. The second time is we're invaded by the Dutch, of all people. Technically, it is an invasion. Technically, we invited them. So we asked them to come and invade us. So I'm not sure it really counts as a true invasion. But the idea really was it was done so that William of Orange could get more resources to go to war against France. The idea was to mobilize English resources against the French. And so Britain then begins to emerge onto the, Britain begins to emerge onto the global stage, so to speak. The Glorious Revolution also means that the monarch now has to work with Parliament. Now, that has partially been true, or quite seriously been true, probably for the last sort of 70 years, last sort of 40 years. Parliament did work and do things with the king, but the king did have certain absolute rights. And so that was one of the major sort of flashpoints for the first civil wars between 1642 and 1660. But even today, modern historians tend to argue about what the 1688 revolution meant. I'm just going to read three major-ish historians who talk about the 1688 revolution, and just listen to the differences here between them all. So the first is from Agnes MacInnes, an article which he wrote in History in October 1982, entitled "What Was the English Revolution?" He says this: why, after failing so often and so dismally before, did Parliament finally triumph in the 1690s? Two things seem to stand out. One of these is a war with France. The conflict was fought on a scale hitherto unknown in England. King William's War cost 3 times as much every year as the Second Dutch War of 1665 to 67. It was, more than anything, this colossal war expenditure which led Parliament, in the course of the 1690s, to rethink the whole problem of government finance and to evolve a new monetary system, which, as we have seen, did so much to enhance the standing of the legislature. The second factor which helps to explain the revolutionary character of the 1690s is the attitude taken by the king himself. Although William was, to quote Bishop Burnet, inclined to be arbitrary, he was, paradoxically, far less tenacious of the crown's prerogatives than any of his predecessors had been. William's real interest had been war against France, not in the English constitution. In consequence, during the course of the 1690s, he cheerfully signed away the royal position in order to get the necessary war supplies. He was the betrayer of English absolutism. So there's an example of somebody who, or at least a historian who sees this whole thing largely as a thing that happens because there are interests in Europe and Britain. Their constitutional crisis, so to speak, is not so important to the king. The king doesn't really care what people are doing behind his back as long as he gets the money. So here is Jonathan Israel in The Independent in 1992 in an article called History in the Making. He says this: the eventual effect of the revolution was to create a new balance between crown and parliament. But this was not because it was glorious, but because the king lacked all legitimacy and because William's concern all along had been to exploit English resources to fight France, not to maximize his power in Britain. During the 1690s, he had spent much of his time campaigning in the Low Countries, content to let Parliament assume control of the administration and taxation of England, so long as it provided him with money, troops, ships, and supplies. And then lastly, this is Jonathan Clarke, who I mentioned before in Revolution and Rebellion, printed in 1986. The rebellion of 1688 was not a bid for a weak monarchy, but for a Protestant monarchy. Consequently, the settlement which followed had much to do with religion, but little to do with placing limits on the monarch's prerogatives in other spheres. We can at least say what 1688 was not about. It was not a conflict between the institutions of monarchy and parliament, let alone between king and commons. In the early Hanoverian, as in the early Stuart period, parliament and government were not synonymous. Monarchy, not democracy, generated society's dominant ideology. So here we can see these are different ways of writing. These are different historiographies in many ways. But their result is that we have a British identity, regardless of how you view any of this. We end up with a British identity which is created by contested versions of the past. And that's kind of where we're going with this. So when it comes to politics and political identity, we end up with a political culture, a very vibrant political culture it is. This is the age of the Whig oligarchy, I suppose. Popular politics in this time period is commercialized. This is where we see very widespread use of press and of the press and pamphlet production. People produce literature, small things that are very cheap to produce, very easy to read, very easy to spread. And also the production of political artifacts and by an evolution of a program of accountability and reform. And I have talked about radicalism in terms of religious radicalism, but radicalism here is also a little difficult to define because it really depends on the era. If you went to the 19th century, democratic ideals were considered to be radical. Radical ideals for the 18th century wanted a purer, refined, and in a way less corrupt electorate, which, remember, is not everybody. We haven't got enfranchisement for everybody. It's just a small group of people still. So there's a focus on resistance to ruling cartels, because the British are, or the English rather, at least have a sense of freedom and liberty. And so we need to make sure this is all completely maintained. So there are some freedoms that we have. So these are expressed through things like trial by jury, habeas corpus, the idea that you can't just willy-nilly grab people and chuck them into prison until you can find something on them, that you actually have to have a whole sort of setup first before you can arrest them. But there are further senses of freedom in the British to do with religious toleration, property rights, they were against the raising of standing armies. Before, when you had an army, you would, again, gather people together, you'd go off and fight your war, and then everybody would be disbanded and go back, except for maybe a few professional soldiers here or there, or knights, depending on how far back you want to go. But in this period, this is where we begin to see a standing army, which is an army who's there all the time, and you have to pay for them. Oliver Cromwell is the one who really put this together with his new model army. And he, it was such a good model that people sort of began to sort of stick to it afterwards, because it allowed you to train and maintain an army, which then could be used at any point, which, of course, if you're on the army side, is a great idea. But if you are on the side that's against the army, then it's not so great, especially if you wish to stage some sort of rebellion or coup. They were also against military barracking, the idea that you have to put people up in your house. So if a soldier came, if the army came through your town, you'd have to put them up inside your house. And most of the time you'd have to pay for them as well, for their food and things like this. They were against tax collection. They were also against police forces. So radicalism in this time period is really more about the defense of your rights rather than about the creation of new rights. So we have the Magna Carta, which is signed in 1215, the Bill of Rights in 1688. These are held onto quite strongly. So we have to maintain our things. It's in a way quite conservative, the conserving of things that you already have. So we have, really, as I said at the beginning of the class a while back, we have two main groups of people. We have the Whigs and the Tories, and they tend to represent the two sides that go back to the first civil war in Britain. So the Whigs represent essentially Parliament, and the Tories kind of essentially represent the monarchy. These are no longer, I suppose, separate identities, because there's no particular problem anymore. So there's no real division, unlike the previous century. Before you had very clear divisions between Parliament and King. And after the Glorious Revolution and beyond, these differences become intermeshed with each other, and so it's very difficult to see where one begins and one ends. So in a way, I guess something like the Tory party doesn't really exist. It's really a state of mind about something, because there's no organization on a national scale. There's no leader in parliament. The Tories, according to John Brooke, were preeminently the landed gentry, which were unconnected with the court. So in other words, it's more of a social thing than a political party. Now, of course, as things go by, people may begin to sort of amp up the temperature on both sides, and maybe talk a little bit more about things that are slightly more political about that. But this is where we are at in 1714, where we have two political identities which are, in theory, based in things not well in the past, quite recently in the past, but are beginning to lose their vigor and their strength, because they no longer the things that made them what they are no longer so very important, and so that will change. They will have to change, and they will become political identities that will look at different things in the future. We won't talk so much about this in the class, because it's not something that there's much to talk about, but it's just good to understand that this is all there. So that's really that's where I'm going to stop now. And what I'll do next time, we've talked about the British revolutions. We've got the sort of the main revolution and the Glorious Revolution, and then I'll talk about responses to other revolutions during the time period as well, the French and the American.